the Mafia's secret son. Domenico, Dom, Russo, leaned back in his first-class seat, the hum of the private jet's engines a faint backdrop to his restless thoughts. The glass of whiskey on the table before him remained untouched, its amber liquid glinting in the dim cabin light. He had everything a man could want: money, power, respect. Yet a void had taken root in his chest, one that no amount of wealth or status could fill. 6 years. It had been 6 years since Sophia had walked out of his life. 6 years since his world had turned monochrome, devoid of the vibrant warmth she had brought into it. With Sophia, life had felt alive, filled with laughter that echoed through the cold halls of his home, meals shared where her smile had been the main course, and nights when her mere presence had made even silence feel comforting. Without her, everything, even the victories and wealth he'd amassed, had felt hollow, as if he were a man living on borrowed time. Dom had buried himself in his work, climbing higher in the criminal underworld, but his appetite for life had withered just as his appetite for food, laughter, and love had. He downed the whiskey in one gulp, the burn doing little to distract him from the memory of her. Sophia. Her name was a blade that cut through his every thought. She had been the only woman who had ever challenged him, the only one who had made him believe he could be more than the son of a ruthless Mafia matriarch. But his mother, Evelina Russo, had never approved of Sophia. "She's not one of us," she had sneered. "She'll weaken you." Dom had fought for Sophia, but Evelina's disapproval was a storm that Sophia had grown too tired to resist. When she left, she didn't just leave him. She left the entire world of crime and control that had suffocated her. The divorce papers had arrived without explanation, and though Dom had tried to find her, Sophia had disappeared like a phantom. Until now. Dom's eyes drifted to the young boy seated across the aisle. The child couldn't have been older than 5 or 6, but something about him tugged at Dom's chest, an inexplicable recognition that sent his mind spiraling. His sharp cheekbones, the unruly dark hair, the piercing hazel eyes. Dom's breath hitched as he realized it wasn't just familiarity. It was undeniable. The boy's face was a mirror of his own younger self, like a ghost of the past, brought to life. Dom's heart began to pound, each beat an echo of questions and possibilities. His fingers tightened around the armrest as a surge of emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, and something unnameable, crashed over him, leaving him rooted to the spot, unable to look away. His sharp cheekbones, the unruly dark hair, the piercing hazel eyes that mirrored Dom's own. It was like staring into a time-warped reflection of himself. Dom's heart clenched, 1,000 questions racing through his mind. "Excuse me?" he called out to the flight attendant, his voice calm but edged with urgency, though adrenaline coursed through him like wildfire. His heart pounded against his ribcage, a primal mix of fear and recognition. The edges of his vision seemed to blur, narrowing in on the boy across the aisle. His breath hitched as he forced himself to stay composed. "That boy over there, who is he traveling with?" The flight attendant's face softened into a polite smile. "He's with his mother, sir. She's in the ladies' room at the moment. Can I get you anything in the meantime?" Dom waved her off, his chest tightening as he leaned back. His instincts screamed that this wasn't a coincidence. As if on cue, the door to the restroom opened, and a woman emerged. She wore a simple but elegant blouse and jeans, her blonde hair cascading in waves around her face. Sophia. Dom's breath caught in his throat. She looked older, her features more refined, but her beauty was undiminished. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. She stopped in her tracks, her face paling as recognition dawned. "Sophia," Dom said, his voice a low rumble, though it faltered slightly as he spoke her name. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt like the air had been sucked from the cabin. The sight of her, older, more refined, but still undeniably Sophia, triggered a torrent of emotions he couldn't control. Anger, Longing and heartbreak crashed together, and for the first time in years Dom felt something raw and human stir deep within him. His hands curled into fists at his sides, not out of rage but as an anchor to keep himself grounded. After all this time, he thought, barely able to contain the storm raging inside him. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her gaze flickered to the boy, then back to Dom, a mix of fear and defiance flashing in her eyes. She took a step forward, clutching the boy's hand. "Dom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He rose to his feet, towering over her as he crossed the aisle. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, his expression a blend of curiosity and wariness. "I could ask you the same question," Dom replied, his tone steady, but laced with intensity. His eyes shifted to the child. "Who is this?" Sophia's grip on the boy's hand tightened. "He's my son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your son," Dom repeated, his mind racing. The boy's resemblance to him was undeniable. "What's his name?" "Luca," she said, her gaze steady but guarded. Dom's heart slammed against his ribs. He crouched down, his eyes level with Luca's. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "How old are you?" Luca hesitated, glancing up at Sophia before answering. "I'm 5. 5. Dom's mind reeled. The timing lined up too perfectly. He stood, his eyes locking onto Sophia's. "Is he mine?" Sophia's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "Dom, this isn't the time or place," she said, her tone steely. She pulled Luca closer, her protective instincts flaring. "Whatever you're thinking, just let it go." Dom's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting. "Don't play games with me, Sophia. I'm not blind. And I'm not having this conversation here," she snapped back, her voice low but firm. She turned her attention to Luca, smoothing his hair as though trying to shield him from the tension in the air. Dom stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "We'll talk when we land. Don't think you can avoid this." Sophia's expression didn't falter, though her grip on Luca's hand tightened. Her eyes darted nervously to Dom, and for a fleeting moment, to the security dog patrolling the cabin, a deep-seated fear she had never entirely overcome. "Fine," she said curtly, her voice clipped, turning away to end the discussion. But the weight of his stare lingered, the unspoken truth hanging heavily between them, mixed with her unease about the canine and the confrontation brewing. A storm of emotions surged through him: shock, anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "You kept him from me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Why?" Tears spilled down Sophia's cheeks, but her voice was sharp and trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I had to protect him, Dom," she said, her words cutting through the heavy air like glass. Her body trembled as conflicting emotions boiled to the surface, a desperate need to shield her son, clashing with the guilt of keeping him from his father. "Every day I hated myself for what I did, for keeping Luca away. But I had no choice." Her voice cracked, the years of fear and isolation spilling out. "Your mother. She's ruthless, Dom. She made it clear what she'd do if I stayed. And I couldn't let my son grow up in the shadow of her power, or yours." Her body trembled as her emotions boiled to the surface, years of suppressed rage and sorrow finally erupting. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think it was easy for me to keep him away from his father? Your world, your family. They're dangerous, Dom. You think I'd risk Luca's life? Risk him being a pawn in your mother's twisted games?" Her voice cracked, her fury giving way to anguish. "I did what I had to do to keep him safe, to keep him out of that life." Dom's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but deep down, he couldn't blame her. His mother's influence had destroyed so much already. Still, the thought of all the years he had missed with his son cut deeper than any knife. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "We're going to talk," he said firmly. "When we land, you and I are going to have a long conversation." Sophia exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping under the weight of emotions she had kept bottled up for years. Her gaze hardened as she met Dom's eyes. "All right, Dom," she said, her tone clipped, tinged with frustration. "But don't think for a second that I'm doing this because I want to. This conversation is inevitable, but that doesn't mean I'm ready for it." She looked away, her grip on Luca tightening. "We'll talk. Just not here." The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. Dom couldn't take his eyes off Luca, studying every detail of the boy who was unmistakably his. The way Luca's small fingers fidgeted with the hem of his shirt reminded Dom of his own restless habits as a child. He noted the sharp angles of the boy's cheekbones, so strikingly similar to his own, and the hazel eyes that held a spark of curiosity and wariness. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest as he imagined all the milestones he had missed. Luca's first steps, his first words, his first laugh. A wave of protectiveness surged through him, mingled with the ache of regret. When they landed, Dom arranged for a car to take them to a private villa he owned on the outskirts of the city. Sophia hesitated but ultimately agreed, knowing she owed him an explanation. In the quiet of the villa's living room, with Luca playing in a nearby room, Dom's patience was wearing thin. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, the tension in the air almost suffocating. "I'm waiting, Sophia," he said, his voice low but charged with frustration. Sophia sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Start with the truth," Dom shot back, turning to face her. His amber eyes burned with intensity, the weight of years of betrayal and questions pressing down on him. "I deserve to know why you left and why you kept my son from me." Her head snapped up at his words, her own anger flaring. "Your son?" she said, her voice rising. "Do you think it was easy for me to make that decision? To leave everything behind?" Tears glistened in her eyes, but her expression was defiant. "I had no choice, Dom. Your mother gave me none." Dom's fists clenched at his sides as he stepped closer. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded. "Evelina threatened me," Sophia said, her voice trembling but firm. "She said if I stayed, if I dared to keep the baby, she'd make sure I regretted it. Do you know what it's like to live in constant fear? To wonder if today will be the day she follows through on her threats?" Her voice cracked as the years of pain spilled out. Dom's chest tightened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You should have come to me," he said, his voice quieter but no less intense. "I would have protected you. Protected Luca." "Would you have?" Sophia asked, her eyes locking onto his. "Would you have chosen us over her? Over the family business? Because I couldn't take that chance. I couldn't let Luca grow up in that world." Dom took a deep breath, the truth of her words striking him like a blow. He sank into a chair, the rigid tension in his posture softening for the first time. He ran a hand through his hair, his amber eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt and longing. "You're right," he admitted softly after a long pause, his voice carrying a vulnerability Sophia hadn't heard before. "Back then, I might not have been able to make that choice. I was too caught up in proving something to everyone else, but things are different now, Sophia." His gaze lifted to meet hers, a quiet determination replacing the sharp edge of his frustration. "I'm different, and I'll prove that to you." Sophia's defenses faltered slightly, her eyes softening as she studied him, but the pain and doubt still lingered. "Dom," she began, her voice hesitant, I don't know if I can trust that. Then let me prove it to you, he said, leaning forward, his voice earnest. Let me be the father Luca deserves, and let me be the man you deserve. Dom ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her words sinking in. Things are different now, he said. I'm not the same man I was 6 years ago, and I'll be damned if I let my mother dictate my life any longer. He stood, crossing the room to kneel before her. I want to be in Luca's life, he said, his voice steady and resolute. I want to be his father. But more than that, I want a second chance with you, Sophia. Sophia looked at him in shock, her heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. Dom, I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had. Too much has happened. Then let's build something new, he said. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I've changed, that I can be the man you and Luca deserve. Sophia's lips trembled as she considered his words. She had spent so many years running, so many years convincing herself that leaving was the right choice. But seeing Dom now, seeing the love and determination in his eyes, made her wonder if, maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them. All right, Dom, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. She stood abruptly, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from the vulnerability she felt. We'll try, she said, her tone sharper now, a small crack, betraying the emotions roiling within. But don't think for a second that I've forgotten how much it hurt to trust you before. Her eyes locked onto his, fierce and searching. It won't be easy, not for you, not for me. So don't make promises you can't keep. Nothing worth having ever is easy, he replied, taking her hand in his. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope sparked in his heart. Perhaps with time and effort, they could heal the wounds of the past and build a future together, a future where they could be a family.